So, Scott, your new book, described as the first comprehensive survey of the history of photography in Bali in pre-independence Indonesia. You've previously focused on Jakarta and the broader Indonesian archipelago. What specifically drew you to Bali for this extensive new project, and what was the primary stimulus for launching this research?
Thank you, Ruben. Very nice to be here today. I've been collecting historic photographs of Indonesia for more than 30 years. And Bali initially was never a focus of my collecting, but it occurred to me that there are really very many beautiful early photographs of Bali taken by such photographers as Isidore van Kinsbergen in the 1860s, or George P. Lewis in the 1910s, or Thilly Weissenborn in the 1920s, Kurt Grundler in the 1910s. Many of these are completely unknown to most people in Bali or in Indonesia, let alone the wider world. And it also became apparent to me that there's been no history of photography on Bali published that I'm aware of. And of course there are many fine books on Balinese paintings or Balinese music or dance or wood carving, sculpture, but nothing on photography per se. And gradually I kept adding to my collection of Balinese photographs, and I acquired some beautiful photographs by Thilly Weissenborn. And then I came across some photographs by Gregor Krause, who was in Bali from 1912 to 1914. He's a medical doctor actually, but spent a lot of time on Bali during that short 18-month period, taking apparently up to 4,000 photographs. It became the first extensive photographic archive of Bali ever taken. And I managed to acquire some of his photographs too from a dealer in Germany. And so my collection continued to grow, and there were other collections that I had access to. And I thought this would potentially make a rather interesting book. And the turning point for me came in 2018, when I saw for sale from a dealer in the United States a collection of glass lantern slides of Balinese scenes, which had been hand-colored by a photographic atelier in Yokohama in Japan. And these are all date back to the middle of the 1930s. And there was a collection of about 150 of them, and I was really struck by some very beautiful photographs. Initially I didn't know who the photographers were, and also by the fact that they were hand-colored in Japan. And I knew that 19th century photography in Japan had a history of hand colouring, and I'd lived in Japan as well and learnt the language for many years. And so here was this rather lovely combination of photographs of Indonesia, meaning Bali, hand-coloured in Japan. And I thought, wow, I have to have these. And I bought them. And it was at that point in 2018 I decided, okay, I would do this book on the history of photography on Bali from 1865 through to 1939. Now, I was at that time already working on my previous book, Faces of Indonesia, 1900 and 1945. So when that was completed at the end of 2020, I then got into this book on Bali photography, 1865 to 1939. So that's a little bit about the background, and I just thought, well, gee, there's been no comprehensive survey of photography on Bali published, and yet there are so many beautiful photographs. These deserve to be seen.
Right. Yeah, as you just mentioned, the book covers a significant period from 1865 to 1939, tracing photography from its pioneering beginnings on the island through the first golden age of tourism. Could you elaborate on why this specific time frame was chosen, and what major shifts in photography and Bali's perception you observed within this period?
Excellent question. Thank you very much, Ruben. Yes, I deliberately chose these three chapters with considerable thought, because the first photographer to go to Bali was Isidore van Kinsbergen in 1865 as part of a government mission. Now, what was interesting then was that the colonial Dutch government really had very little influence on Bali at that time. I mean, Batavia dates back to 1619, Jakarta, or Batavia itself, but even so as a Dutch, part of a Dutch colony or a VOC-controlled city, Batavia dated back to 1619. But it wasn't really until 1846 that the Dutch tried to take control of Bali. And there was a military campaign by the Dutch against Bali in 1846, which failed. And then there was another one in 1847, which also failed. And so the Dutch were a bit shocked by the militaristic capabilities of the Balinese, who turned out to be excellent guerrilla fighters. And so it was only really with the third military expedition of 1849 that the Dutch were able to take control only of northern Bali. That was 1849, and it wouldn't be until 16 years later, in 1865, that a Governor-General wanted to visit Bali and look at what little of Bali they controlled at that point. And he took along Isidore van Kinsbergen with him. And so the theme there is really militarism. The Balinese were skilled fighters and warriors, and there were actually a total of 7 military expeditions between 1846 and 1908 before the Dutch were able to totally control Bali. And the last two, 1906 and 1908, included the terribly tragic Puputan, which we all know, and very sad, very tragic. And so it's interesting when you look at the photographs of Bali before 1920, you do see a militaristic theme come through, like the Van Kinsbergen photograph you see here. Here's a man with his weapon. He's a prince with his weapon, and you go a bit further along. You see a rebel, Imade Rai, was fighting against the Dutch until he was captured in 1868. And you go a bit further along, even into more warriors from Van Kinsbergen's trip in 1865, even though they weren't published until 1896. And then early postcards, you show some of the militaristic dances on Bali. So the image that people had of Bali in the early decades of European contact with Bali wasn't of beautiful dances and beautiful music. It was, hey, these guys are serious fighters. And this was an interesting theme. You don't think of the Balinese now as militaristic warriors, but that's certainly what the Dutch thought from the 1840s through until about the 1910s. And now, why did I stop in 1914? Because the Dutch took control of Bali in 1908, and there was a military administration on Bali until 1914. And so the first chapter really is 1865 until 1913 really. And so that theme of the Dutch taking control. And so there weren't many photographers at that time, but yes, there were Balinese rulers, there were Balinese princes, there was the occasional musician, but you don't see dancers in photographs of Bali before 1920. But you do see weapons, you do see fighters. Okay. Now the following year, the beginning of chapter 2, part 2, which only runs from 1914 to 1927, 13 years, and it sounds like an odd choice of years, 1914 to 1927, but 1914 was important because the administration of Bali changed from military to civilian. And the Dutch government decided at that time that they would treat Bali differently to the rest of the Netherlands Indies. So Bali would be allowed to stay Balinese. So the traditional Balinese culture, art, sculpture, music would be promoted. You would not see railroads or factories or plantations on Bali. So that was going to be part of how the Dutch would present Bali to the world after the horrific reputation that the Dutch got for the Puputan of 1906, 1908. So it's almost like the Dutch were cleansing themselves by, let's make Bali this paradise. And also, in 1914, there was a guidebook published of Java, or East Java and Bali, and Lombok, and it included an entire chapter on Bali in 1914. And this was the first time in any book that a whole chapter had been devoted to tourism on Bali. It was a tourist guidebook published in 1914. Also, in 1914, you had the opening of the first tourist office in Bali, in Singaraja. So 3 things happened in 1914. Civilian administration started. The first guidebook published, which included an entire chapter on Bali, and you had the opening of the tourist office. And now, that up till 1927, the problem with visiting Bali was that there were no hotels. There was a Pasanggrahan guest house, which you could stay there if there were no government officials staying there. and there wasn't really a regular service of ship transport for passengers as opposed to freight between Surabaya and Buleleng, Singaraja, until I think around 1924. And so even though there was a tourist office from 1914, even though there was a guidebook published in 1914, tourists couldn't actually get to Bali, and if they got there were no hotels anyway. So in 1928, which is the beginning of the third chapter, the Bali Hotel opened. And so 1914 to 1927 is a sort of a transitional period. So the civilian administration, the guidebook, the tourist office, not much activity, some beautiful photographs taken by Thilly Weissenborn. But then by 1928, you had the Bali Hotel opening, and you had these big cruise ships from the golden age of the rich film stars and multimillionaires and tycoons of the day would go on these long cruises. And Bali began to appear on the itineraries, and they stayed at the Bali Hotel. And then that made Bali more famous. And then by the 1930s, you had a lot of photographers coming into Bali. And so it's no surprise that part 3, which is 1928 to 1939, that runs from really the opening of the Bali Hotel through to the outbreak of World War II, and then 3 years later that Japan invaded Bali, as it did the rest of the Indies. And so this 11-year window between 1928 and 1939 saw the first golden age of tourism, although it was still an expensive place to visit, and they only had a few thousand tourists a year, but it was still important. And a lot of photographers were working on Bali. Now, some of them were professionals, some of them were painters like Walter Spies, some of them were actually professional photographers like Katie Satake, others were amateurs, and some left beautiful photographs, and I've been able to source some of those for this book as well. So it's a long way of answering your question, but that's how the structure of the book came about.
Perfect, Scott. Yeah, so Bali was often then described as a last paradise by foreign writers, artists, and ethnographers. How did photography, particularly during the early 20th century, contribute to shaping this perception for a global audience? And were there any deliberate efforts by the colonial administration to promote this image? Perhaps.
Yes, another very thoughtful question. Thank you. Yes, I think photography derived from two sources, really, Ruben. Yes, there was an official government tourist bureau starting in 1914, and by the 1920s they were publishing guidebooks and brochures and pamphlets about Bali, and photography became an important part of that. And they had stock of photographs available too, so that tourist organizations could get photographs from the tourist bureau, etc., either in Batavia, Jakarta, or from Singaraja. But you also had an extremely active, lively artistic scene in Bali in the 1930s. A lot of it centered around Walter Spies. And he arrived in Bali, I think, 1927, 1928. And he was a multi-talented man, musician, artist, photographer. He seemed to do everything. And he's also a very generous man with his time and his knowledge. And so you had other people like photographers, painters, musicians, and anthropologists, musicologists come to Bali, and they all gravitated to Walter Spies, and he helped them all. And there was an extraordinarily productive output, an extraordinary productive period of creativity during the 1930s. And that really comes through, I think, if you look at part 3 of this book, that because Walter Spies was a talented photographer as well. It turns out some of the photographs that I bought on those glass lantern slides in 2018 were actually by Walter Spies. That was a real thrill. And amongst others as well, of course, like Katie Satake. So as I'm saying, on one hand, yes, you had the official tourist bureau promoting tourism on Bali through their publications. And on the other hand, you had private initiatives through creativity of some very creative people who happened to be, or who were attracted to Bali in the 1920s and 1930s. Now, please imagine for a minute, World War I was 1914 to 1918. Horrific, 20 million people dead, much of Europe destroyed. And then you could then take a ship and come to Bali. It was beautiful tropical paradise and lovely people, male and female, and palm trees and beaches and village huts, and it's no wonder people coming out of a European environment came to Bali and were just enchanted by what they saw. And then, of course, in the late 1920s, 1929, and it got more severe into the early 1930s, the world went into a Great Depression. And again, you had misery and unemployment. And so again, this image of Bali as this tropical paradise, I mean, was something which really captured the world's imagination. And Bali was featured in magazines and newspapers and books all around the world, especially in the 1930s, from the late 1920s through until the 1930s. Of course, by the time you get to 1939, the world has gone to war again, World War II. But Bali was this paradise.
Ah, that's why. Yeah, and your book explores a full range of photographic formats, from original prints to postcards to glass lantern slides and several forms of early color photography. What unique insights did each of these different formats offer into how Bali was documented and presented to the outside world again?
Yes, thank you. Yes, certainly the full range of photographic techniques as photography emerged, represented here in the book. We have, going back to the 1860s, you have the album and prints that were made from glass plate negatives by Isidore van Kinsbergen. And then they were replaced by paper, printing on paper. And you have stereotypes, and you have stereotypes taken by where you have two images side by side, but with one just a little bit to the left or right of the other. And you have those on paper and glass as well. Then you have large format photographs taken on paper with large format cameras. And then you go through to photographs being taken and used on postcards. And the postcards, of course, going all around the world, and people seeing images of Bali for the first time on a postcard, which sold very cheaply but could go all around the world. And then, of course, by the late 1920s, you had the first autochromes by Price, working for the National Geographic magazine. That was an early form of colour photography. And then you went through into the Kodachromes by 1935 and 1936. So my book looks here at some of the autochromes from National Geographic in 1928. By the time that National Geographic returns to Bali to explore colour, it's already, I think, 1939 or 1938, 1939. And again, we've moved away from autochromes onto Kodachrome. And so then Kodachrome, of course, dominated by the 1950s after World War II was over, and colour photography had largely replaced black and white in most settings, not all but most. Kodachromes took over really until the digital age began at the end of the last century, beginning of this one. And so it's all represented. And of course, we also had the glass lantern slides as well that you mentioned, which were essentially taking a black and white photograph on paper and then printing it on glass, colouring it, and then putting another pane of glass on. And that was also superseded by Kodachromes. So the glass lantern slides I have in this book are really coming towards the end of the era for glass lantern slides. And Kodachrome would soon take over. So yes, the whole spectrum of different photographic techniques on glass and on paper, individual images, stereotypes, black and white, colour, or even like Thilly Weissenborn was using very atmospheric sepia in the early 1920s. I mean, she could have printed in black and white, but it was very much her style. She thought we assume she thought that she could capture the light, or the light she was so working hard to capture could be better represented through sepia rather than through black and white. So yes, there's a whole range of images being represented here, and photographic techniques being represented here. Yes, yeah.
She's quite a pioneer, isn't she?
Yes, she is.
Yeah,
very much so.
Yeah, you also dedicate a significant attention to individual photographers in the book.
Yes.
Could you maybe again highlight some of the most influential early photographers, both professional and amateur perhaps, who visited Bali during the colonial era, and what made their work particularly significant or unique in your eyes?
Yes, yes. Well, one interesting theme that comes through there, Ruben, is trained painters who turn to photography. So, for example, like at the beginning, I mentioned Isidore van Kinsbergen, and he was very, very influential because he was the first photographer to go to Bali, but he also trained as a painter. In fact, before he became a photographer, he worked as a theatre set painter. You know, the sets at the back of the theatre, he used to paint those. So if you look at the lovely composition of Kinsbergen's photographs, he wasn't just asking you to stand there and take a photograph. He carefully posed the subject. And then you have some of the early colour photography of Franklin Price Knott. Now again, he trained as a portrait painter, and he turned to colour photography with the autochrome. And again, the composition is very, 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 very well thought through. Then you have Walter Spies, of course, trained as a painter and as a musician. And again, we see the lovely artistic composition of Walter Spies. Look at the angle here, the angle there. So it's very interesting how their training, their background as a painter influenced the composition for the photography. Then you had like Rose Covarrubias, for example, who was the wife of the famous painter Miguel Covarrubias. She was actually a dancer, and it's interesting that her love of dancing influenced her photography too, because their dancing comes through in her photography. Here's an older girl teaching a young girl to dance. So she trained as a dancer herself, and here she is very much focusing on photography of dancers. Now this is how individual photographers can bring through their own conception. Now, like Thilly Weissenborn, who was based in Garut in West Java, her studio there was called Lux. Lux in Latin means light. And she trained for years to capture light. Her specialty was capturing light, like you see the way the light falls on the faces or on the bodies. That was her specialty. And again, in Bali, it was very much the way the light falls. And then printing in sepia, which was definitely not common in the 1920s. Again, I think she felt this just best captured the light that she wanted to capture. And also, she also captured, being there in the early 20s, she started photographing dancers, which, as I mentioned before 1920, there's very few dancers photographed on Bali because the focus was, we've just come through 7 military expeditions against these tough fighters, the Balinese. But now in the 1920s, as tourism is being developed, the emphasis is that you don't see militaristic images anymore. Now we're moving into the dancing and the music and the religion. And this really shines through. Look at that, it's her most famous photograph. And so we've got a beautiful dancer. So the whole perception of Bali has undergone a rebranding, so to speak. That's not a good word to use, but a redesign, or the image of Bali certainly had changed quite a lot between, say, 1900 and 1925. I mean, then by the time you get into the 1930s, you could almost be criticized for there being too many photographs of dancers. There's an enormous number of photographs of dancers by the time we get into the late 1920s, 1930s, but particularly the young, beautiful female dancers, but also some of the very artistic male dancers like Mario, etc. But the young girls, like we see the dancing, the legong in Denpasar, and so some of these are really beautiful photographs, and so some of the dancers became very famous in their own right, as we can see over here. So So like Ni Chawan, Iwayan Rindi and Ni Sadri, 2 girls and 1 boy dancing. And these 3 dances appear very frequently. And so dancing became a real theme of the 1930s, and it became obligatory if you were going on a cruise and then staying at the Bali hotel. The dancing would be organised for you in the evening, and probably again the following day as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, with you mentioned about the opening of the Bali hotel in Denpasar in 1928, and also the rise of international luxury cruise liners,
Yes.
and the subsequent easier access to the island in 1930s, just like you just said.
Correct.
Bali then entered what was described as its first golden age of tourism again, and how did these developments influence the types of images captured and ultimately transform how Bali was presented to the wider world, especially when compared to previous photographic techniques like the hand-colored glass lantern slides. So what changed during this time on?
Well, the hand-coloured glass lantern slides were the 1930s as well. But certainly it became a focus on villages and dance and music by that stage. And maybe there was a significant influence by Walter Spies as well, because he lived in a world that overlapped art and music, and of course he worked with Beryl de Zoet on that book on dance and drama in Bali as well, and so the focus certainly became more towards the Balinese arts. So both for amateur photographers and like someone like Adrianus Nippius, he worked in a tailor's store, Penjahit. And in Batavia, but he was very active. In Bandung, I think, and he was very active in the Photographic Society. So he was an amateur, earned his money from working in a tailor store, but his passion was definitely photography. Then you have like Duncan Hodges, for example. These are large format images, again dance, which had been prepared for an exhibition. You had Branson de Koo, who was a professional, taking images which he could sell on his glass lantern slides, what he called his dream pictures that he would travel around the world with and give lectures and present the glass lantern slides as he travelled. And then you had Gotthard Schuh from Switzerland, who was the pioneer of the photo book. He spent his early career as a photographer working for some of these photographic magazines which came out in the 1930s, like you're familiar with Life magazine, I'm sure, where before the 1930s, a magazine would have mainly text with a few photographs. And then with some of these photo magazines coming out, it changed, where you had the photograph became the story with a little bit of text. And Gotthard Schuh became one of the first to produce a book. It happened to be on his visit to Islands of the Gods, one of which was Bali. He went to Java as well, and I think Sumatra. But again, he produced these photo books. So again, a different approach. And Colin McPhee was a musicologist, and yet he also turned out to be a very talented photographer. And again, no surprise, a musicologist is taking photographs of musicians and dancing. And some of these are really quite striking individual photographs. And Philip Hansen Hiss, also very talented young man, but he came at the end of the 1930s, and sadly for him, when his book came out, I think in 1941, the craze for all things Balinese was largely ending because World War II had taken over. But for those who were around in the early or mid-1930s, they had a tremendous opportunity to express their artistic creativity through photography in Bali.
All right. So I guess we can now also move on to maybe your personal reflections and on the research process of making the book. I mean, I can imagine maybe there's a relative lack of information in international archives regarding early photography on Bali compared to maybe Java or Sumatra.
Exactly right.
But how did you navigate these research constraints, and what methods maybe did you employ to unearth the background of these photographers?
Sure. Yes, certainly with my previous books I was able to use digital archives, digitized archives, like on delpha.nl, which is, I think, funded by the Dutch government, but run, I think, by about 4 Dutch universities. And that was a way of looking at archives of newspapers that had been published in Dutch during the colonial era. But there was never, ever a Dutch language newspaper published on Bali, so that resource was closed to me. So it became a matter of, with the individual photographers, having to track down individuals who could help, willing to help. And there were some people who were incredibly helpful. There were some people I'm extremely grateful to. You can never do a book like this by yourself. And some people came to me with ideas saying, have you looked at this photographer or that photographer? I say, oh, no, I haven't. I would have some photographs and then show someone who would say, well, I don't know myself, but I can put you in touch with someone who does, or why don't you contact this person? So I'm really very, very grateful, and I mentioned in the acknowledgements, there are certain people, maybe a dozen or so really, who are wonderfully helpful, and without their contributions and their generous enthusiasm, a generous contribution and assistance, enthusiasm, this book would not have been possible to make the way it is. And I'll be the first one to say as well that, as this is the first, what I think, comprehensive survey of early photography on Bali, but not complete. And I think we're going to see, and indeed I've already seen, that people will come to us after seeing this book and say, hey, you didn't include this photographer, or you left out these photographs, or hey, you didn't put in this information. And I'm going to say, wow, thank you. So if we ever do a second printing, we will be able to make it even more comprehensive or more complete in the future. Obviously, with any book, at some point you have to draw a line and say, well, this is what we've got, let's publish the book. But certainly there'll be new photographers we didn't know about before the book was published, which will become apparent, and new information. Even on photographers that we have in the book, we'll have to find new information on them. And so it's a process of, okay, this is now out there, and I know people will contact me. In fact, some already have. And so this process of learning will continue.
Never stops, right?
Never stops. Never stops. Yes.
This book is clearly a testament to your personal journey of more than 30 years, is it now, as a collector and researcher of colonial era photographs.
Of Indonesia.
And of Indonesia, definitely. And what was the most surprising discovery or thrill you experienced during the research and acquisition process for this book?
Uncovering new things. For example, almost at the end of the process of when the book was published, I was able to acquire from Germany some amateur stereo views of Bali. They had a handwritten dates on the back, August 1913. It's rare as a collector of photographs to find photographs that have a date on them, surprisingly. So you've really got to narrow down the dates through your own research. But this actually had August 1913 on the back. And the dealer in Germany was able to sell me the glass plate negatives and the printed stereotypes on paper, on card. And I love having the glass plate negative and the stereo printed on paper as well. And to think that this came like 1 month before the book was finished. Extraordinary.
Extraordinary indeed.
Thilly Weissenborn. There's been a lot of debate in the past about which photographs were taken by the Atelier Kurkdjian and which photographs were taken by Thilly Weissenborn, who happened for a while to work for the Atelier Kurkdjian. And so there was a lot of debate about which photographs were by the Atelier Kurkdjian and George Lewis, or which photographs were by Thilly Weissenborn when she worked for, if any, were by Thilly Weissenborn when she worked for the Atelier Kurkdjian, and which photographs were by Thilly Weissenborn after she left the Atelier Kurkdjian to start her own studio. Now, research which I was able to do, courtesy of Delphi.nl, showed that in fact between June 1912 and about September 1914, she was working with another lady at a photographic studio of their own in Bandung. Therefore, she couldn't have been working for the Atelier Kurkdjian between June 1914 and September. So between June 1912 and September 1914. And therefore, she couldn't have been taking any photographs for Atelier Kurkdjian which can be reliably dated as being before September 1914. And we were able to establish which photographs were George P. Lewis, and that all of the photographs that could be reliably attributed to Thilly Weissenborn of Bali were taken after she left the Atelier Kurkdjian. So it doesn't sound like much to someone who's not a collector or a researcher, but to be able to and part of this was because of access to albums we had which were dated, and research in Holland and research in Australia. And so to be able to now more definitively be able to say, well, these photographs are by this photographer, and these are by this photographer, and this photographer, like Thilly Weissenborn, could not have been with Atelier Kurkdjian between June 1912 and September 1914, because we definitively know she was running her own studio in Bandung at that time. So, so things like that, and also uncovering photographers that people had really never heard of before, like Kurt Grundler, who was a German who accompanied a German anthropological expedition in eastern Indonesia in 1911. But he, while he was on Bali, took some beautiful photographs, and I think people will now know more about Kurt Grundler. Another one is after it, we've got, I'll show you here, Ernst Alfred Goethes, who was again a German military surveyor who happened to be in Bali. You know, he was assigned to Bali he worked for the Netherlands Indies government, and I had quite a few postcards that had EAG on the back of them, and I didn't know what the EAG meant, but through a process of being able to cross-reference him and the photographs he took and the postcards when they were printed, we learnt that EAG stood for Ernst Alfred Goethes, and so that's a new name which people didn't really have before. And there are another couple of examples like that as well. And also, again, with a very helpful information from a good friend in Japan, a Japanese gentleman, we were able to get very good information on Keiti Satake, which almost really wasn't available before. So, as I say, again, there were about a dozen people who provided wonderful help and assistance to me, and I'm just so grateful to them, and just so looking forward to giving copies of this book to them. And some I already have, others I haven't yet had the chance to do that, but I will. And just so satisfying, and I'm just so grateful for their input and their contributions.
Super fascinating. You also expressed hope that this book will serve as a stimulus for further research. What specific areas or mysteries in the history of Bali photography do you believe still require further investigation?
Well, a benchmark I set for myself, Ruben, for a photograph to be included in the book, I had to know either who the photographer was or be able to date it within 5 years of when it was taken. And if I couldn't do either of those, I wouldn't include it in the book, even if it was a beautiful photograph. If I didn't know who the photographer was and I couldn't say it was within 5 years of a particular year, what did I have? I had nothing. I got a beautiful photograph, but who was the photographer? What year was it taken? I couldn't tell you within 5 years. So I would hope that many more photographs going forward, we will be able to identify the photographers, identify when the photographs were taken, that we'll uncover more photographers, and we'll also get a better idea of what they were photographing, the Balinese cultural life that they were photographing, and as I said, that changed from like a militaristic approach to what was being depicted through to a much more cultural and artistic approach. So we'll learn more about how Bali was represented, what influences influenced the people who took the photographs, what they were photographing, how Bali was presented to the world. So I think we can learn more about that as we go forward, and more material will become available, and we'll learn more. So I always put my email address in my books, and people do contact me, and I know from my earlier books that people will contact me, and there'll be a lot more information, and there'll be some great interactions. And if there ever is a revised edition of this book, I hope that we'll be able to update or include additional information or correct any errors, or there's still so much to learn.
Awesome. So just finally, What do you hope readers then will take away from Bali photography 1865 to 1939? And what is its lasting contribution to the understanding of Bali's history and its unique cultural representation through photography?
Well, I would hope that people will gain a greater appreciation for the history of Bali, and also the role that photography played in presenting that history, and understanding the different eras in the life of Bali and the Balinese from the 1860s through to the 1930s, and what was happening in Bali and how that was revealed by photography.
Right.
And who was on Bali taking photographs, what they were taking photographs of, what influenced them to take those photographs, how Bali was presented to the world. So I would hope it will stand alongside the many books we already have on Balinese art, paintings, wood carvings, music, textiles, and bring a different facet of Balinese cultural life, meaning photography, to readers and the people who enjoy the book.
Sure, we will. We all will. Thank you so much, Scott, for your time.
Thank you, Ruben.